as we're going is okay with me. If I'm just droning on with no feedback for too long, other than the occasional, smile and nod on the screen, it's hard to know if I'm just putting you all to sleep or not. So thanks again for being here. And such an exciting topic as rent control, which I get to talk about a lot. So where are we? We're going to start talking about Portland. There have been 3 referendums on rent control in Portland. The first was in 2017, and we mounted a campaign. I've still got my sign in my room. I should have brought it out. No on one, and we defeated it. It's almost hard to remember now. We beat back the forces of rent control 2-1 in the election in 2017. Then it was back again 3 years later in 2020. That election was during COVID. We were not out having neighborhood meetings. It was during the presidential race and the Senate race. And we could not get a message through. We couldn't rally the same level of support we had. And so, although it was only 3 years later and we just beaten it 2-1, we lost, and rent control passed in Portland in 2020. We sued the landlord association, then sued the city, contesting the constitutionality of the rent control ordinance, and went to court and mounted a great argument and had some good, we feel really good about the suit we brought, but the judge did not decide in our favor. So rent control was upheld. In 2022, this past year, they brought forward an even tighter version of the rent control that was already in place. And I'll touch on some of the changes that changed. And so rent control passed again, and whether I was calling it 2.0, maybe it's more 1.2 version of rent control that we have in Portland that just passed in November, this past November. So that's what we've got. What we are doing now is, and I'll talk about this probably more at the end, but I'll preview that we are collecting signatures to get on the ballot in June and change rent control. Because when something passes by referendum in Portland, the only way to change it is by another referendum. So of the whole 17-page ordinance that passed, we're trying to make one little tweak to it, a very important tweak, and hope to have that on the ballot in June. The signatures are submitted. And again, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So there's rent control in Portland. There's rent control being considered in South Portland, but it's gone through the council and they've taken a long time, and it is much less objectionable, much more reasonable than the version we have in Portland. Bangor is also considering rent control, and they just had a council hearing last night about it. I think they got some press, and I was on a call earlier today with some different reps from around the state, and the gentleman from Bangor testified, but his feeling was they're not really listening to them and are just going to go ahead with what they want to do up there. Relatedly, there are a slew of bills around housing and rental housing landlord-tenant law going in at the state level, and our lobbyist Dan Bernier, our being the Rental Housing Alliance lobbyist Dan Bernier, said he's never seen this many bills at the state level on landlord-tenant law. So we're also watching all of those, everything from eliminating application fees to 90-day notice to you can't ask about whether an applicant has had a prior eviction, pets, I mean, just on and on and on. So it's coming at us from all angles here. And I think as a community advocating for housing and housing rights, it's really, really important that the realtor community is engaged. At the local, state, and national level, the realtor organization is very opposed to rent control, and as a policy will support our efforts to combat rent control. And NAR and MAR and the Greater Portland Board have all made contributions to rent control campaigns that we've had over the last few years, and are engaged again now with this next effort we're mounting. So that's a little bit about where we are on the landscape without getting too into detail. Anything I forgot on that, or any questions about that at sort of the high level? Paul, if I forget something, just let me know. So let's go into Portland's rent control a little bit, and we could get really in the weeds here. So I'm going to do my best to give you an overview of some of the key things that you should know in Portland. And I just put in the chat a link to the city's rent control page. And this is really a great resource that if 6 months from now you forget everything I said, which you probably should, but then you've got a client looking to buy in Portland and you're saying, oh, wait, what was that? How did that work? Know that there are resources out there. Google it, find it. But the city has a pretty decent FAQ that will guide you through most of what you need, the high level. Again, there are lots of specifics that are going to get confusing. You're not here to get a master's in this, and as your client's agent, you should not pretend to be an expert on the subject, but you should know enough to get them in the ballpark of the issues and point them to resources. The other link I'll put up while I'm thinking of it is, all my windows here, is the Rental Housing Alliance. We rebranded ourselves this past year. We are the Southern Maine Landlord Association for many years. We just took landlord out of the name for the same reason we're taking master bedroom out of names, and lots of other words we're changing. And we're now the Rental Housing Alliance of Southern Maine, and new look and feel, and a lot of resources there too on this topic. Yes, we will figure out how to get you emailed links. So I kind of use the FAQ as an outline for what I want to touch on today. I'm just going to talk through it. This is, it's a lot of details and a lot of numbers. So I'm just going to kind of say it, know that the FAQ is there, and ask questions as we go. And I think just hear it all, and then you'll know enough to know what you kind of know and what you kind of don't know. So first and foremost, you should know the city staff of Portland does not want rent control. The city of Portland did not drive this process. So it feels like it's us versus the city. And when you call and you complain, you're annoyed with them. They hate this. I had a meeting with them about a month ago, folks in charge of this department. They would love for this to go away. They might have asked us to sue them again to try and make it go away. We did look at suing them again, and our attorneys didn't think it was going to be any more successful than the first time, which is why we're doing this petition to try and make changes ourselves. So know that the city wants to be a resource. It's complicated. They're completely overwhelmed. They've got 18,000 units, all confused and all complicated, trying to figure this out. They're just trying to do their job. So what units are covered by rent control in Portland? Basically, everything's covered except owner-occupied 2, 3, and 4 unit multifamilies. That means a rented single family is covered by rent control. A rented condo is covered by rent control. Anything that's rented residentially is pretty much covered unless you live in the 2 unit, live in the 3 unit, or live in the 4 unit. If it's subsidized, the other big exception is if it's subsidized, Section 8, GA, you receive subsidy, that unit is not encumbered by rent control. So that's on sort of a tenant by tenant basis. So what's unique about the rent control in Portland, and is different than most, is that the rent stays with the unit. And so what they had us do was register your base rent. So whatever your rent was in June of 2020 needed to get filed with the city. And then each year you have to re-register your units, pay a fee, and now tell them what your new rent is, like what your old rent is, how much you went up, like all this information. It's really cumbersome and really complicated. So they know what your rent was in June of 2020. And then they ask a couple points along the way, and then what it is at the beginning of each year when you have to re-register. And the most important thing about Portland for you and your clients to know is the rent sticks to the unit. So other than the exception that I mentioned, owner occupied 2, 3, and 4, the rent stays with the unit. So if you buy a 3 unit building that was not owner occupied and your client is not going to owner occupy it, then the rents are the rents. When that tenant leaves, the rent is basically the same. It'll go through the little changes, but it sticks. And I've been asked recently, well, does it reset with a new owner? No, the rent do not reset with the new owner. The purpose of this is to really fix rents in the city of Portland. So they can't, the whole city really gets stuck where it is and can only climb at the rates that have been prescribed in the ordinance. So what are those rates? The first version of rent control allowed you to increase rents once a year with CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So rents could go up with inflation. And that inflation number is set every September based on Boston's number. The city releases it in September, and then the rent can be increased. Version 2.0, that passed last November, now you can only get 70% of CPI. So you can't increase rents with all of inflation, only 70% of inflation. I think over time, that math probably doesn't work out in favor of housing providers. In the first version, you could also take an increase in rent if the taxes went up, if the property taxes went up. So if your property taxes went up $1,000, you could spread that $1,000 out across all your units and make those increases so you to recoup that $1,000 over the year. So you get CPI plus the property tax. Now you don't get the property tax. So you get only 70% of CPI. That's basically the only increase you get on a yearly basis. And you can only raise the rent once a year. The other increase you're allowed is when a tenant leaves, you can get a 5% increase. So, and then you can layer those on top of each other. So if you haven't raised the rent for more than a year, your tenant leaves, you could charge the 5% plus the 70% of the CPI number. It's already starting to get complicated, right? You can never raise the rent more than 10%. So there used to be more things you could add when you had the property taxes. Now you're probably not going to get more than 10% anyway, but you can never raise more than 10%. If you make improvements to the property and you say, you know, this is now a different unit. I've gutted it. I put in a new kitchen. I've upgraded the counters. You can go before the rent board and ask them nicely if they will allow you to increase the rent more than the allowance because you just spent all this money on the property. And we've seen from the rent board sort of a mixed bag. They approve some increases, they don't approve some. We don't really have good guidance on when they do and when they don't. They are not economists, they are not bookkeepers. In fact, they're primarily tenants who have no experience with this. They're all volunteers. And I would say the rent board is painful to watch at best and pathetic that it is actually the way the city of Portland runs and that these decisions are made. And that's not impugning the intentions of the people on the board. They're just tasked with a level of responsibility that does not have enough guidance from the ordinance and requires a level of knowledge of properties and finance and depreciation and all this stuff that they don't have. I don't have, frankly. So it's a bad setup. So your client should know, and you should know, you can raise rents, but you have to go before the rent board. You should go before you spend the money and say, I plan to do these things and it's going to cost me this much. Will you allow me to raise the rents and by how much? Or you can spend the money and then go in and hope. There's more nuance in all that. And if there are capital improvements versus whatever, and things changed again in the newest version, I don't even know it well enough. Don't worry about it. If you want to go do it, then you can go read it. But I think for capital improvements, you're now supposed to spend at least 20 or 25% of your property's total value to get any increase from that. So if your property's worth $1 million, you have to spend $250,000 in capital improvements. Like it's absurd. Any questions so far? Okay. Notices. You used to have to give 45-day notice to increase rents. Then it went to 75 with rent control, then went to 90. Also now there's 90 days to terminate an at-will tenancy. At will tenancy is the status of your tenants if they are not under a lease. If your tenant's under a lease, I believe this doesn't apply. And so if you have a lease that says, you know, in the last 30 days of the lease, we can issue a notice of non-renewal and then they have to go, I think the law will still stay with your lease. So it's a reason to keep your tenants on a lease so that you have a document defining the terms of the end of the tenancy and you don't default to the tenancy at will, which is a state statute, and now also has Portland's rent control layered on top of it. Because if you want to get a tenant at will out now, you have to give 90 days notice. And if you want them out in 60 to 90 days, they can agree to go, but you also have to pay them 1 month's rent. If you want them out in 30 to 60 days, they also have to agree, and you have to pay them 2 months' rent. So you could have a problem tenant that's making life miserable for all their neighbors. And I have one of these at the moment where their neighbors are not sleeping. And you could be in a position of having to pay them 2 months' rent to leave within 30 days. That's not fun. And they have to agree to it. You can't actually make them leave with a 2 month rent payment. That's only with their consent. So that's an option. So that's great. In Portland, there are no longer application fees allowed. So when tenants are applying for your unit, you can't charge an application fee. You can only take 1 month security. Prior to this, the state statute allows no more than 2 months security deposit to be collected. Now in Portland, you can only have 1 month security deposit collected. And there is a city rental housing rights document that you need to provide and they need to sign. So don't think that you can get a tenant who's not aware of all these rules because you're going to give them a document that tells them all these rules and they're going to sign. That's sort of the high level overview of Portland's rent control. There's a concept of banked rent, I guess I forgot to mention, which is if you have more rent increases that you could take or didn't take. If you could have taken your CPI increase and you just didn't raise the rent on your tenant this year, you could bank it and hold it in reserve and then take it the next year. Does that make sense? So you could bank, if you don't want to raise the rent on your tenant for 3 years, you can not raise the rent and you could not take that CPI increase. So like last year it was 4%, this year it's 7%, and kind of you could be accruing them and then take them at once. But then you hit the 10% ceiling, so you can't really take them all at once. You can only take up to 10%, and then the remaining is still banked. And again, you need a math degree to keep track of this stuff.
So much math.
Yeah.
Brit, we've got a couple of questions. Linda Mears would like to know, is the 90-day notice statewide or just Portland?
Everything I've talked about is Portland.
Okay.
Portland is considerably more strict than the state, like a lot more. Now, some of the proposals in at the state right now, as I referenced, are starting to catch up. So there is a 90-day proposal at the state that you should all contact your local reps and say, why are you coming after landlords? Chill out. This is too much. The state's version doesn't have the payouts of the 1 month and 2 month rent, but it does have a 90-day notice.
Who's policing all of this? Like Can
you ask that question again? What do you mean?
Like who? So to your point.
Who's enforcing it?
Yeah, like who's policing all of this as far as if I own, 10 units, and I have got my head in a hole somewhere and I have no idea what's going on and I'm just doing what I want. Is there?
Right. That's a great question, Kim. This is primarily a complaint-driven system. So what I've said to people on certain issues, and I don't have an example in my mind right now, but if your tenants are happy, they're happy. If they complain, then they're going to look into your situation and see if you did something wrong. If you didn't sign that document, but no one complains, no one's coming after you to make sure that document's in your file. For example, if you give a 30-day notice and they leave and you didn't pay them, well, they left and you didn't pay them. Everybody's happy. Like no one's managing the day-to-day operations. But the thing that will catch you on the rental amounts is you do have to fill out that form every year and attest to the truth of the form of what your rents are. So at some point you could be caught if you're increasing your rents at a higher rate than is allowed. You are sort of documenting that fact or you're lying about it. So that's the part that I think you probably shouldn't fudge. They don't have the technology to really figure it out right now. I don't know how they would catch it. You're just writing it on a piece of paper. You know, my rent was 1,000 last year and now it's 1,200. Oops, I went up too much. I don't know whether they would actually catch it if the tenant didn't bring it up, because I think they're overwhelmed. But that's where they conceivably could. There are fines that are allowed. The city is really reluctant to, or not inclined to issue fines if you comply. And we've seen a lot of situations where the rent went up too much, the tenant complains, the city calls the landlord and says, hey, you raised your rent too much. Landlord says, oh, sorry, they drop it. Maybe they have to refund a little money and everybody's happy. So the city's not out to penalize the housing providers. If Ethan Strimling was in charge, he would. And if you followed the court case, and I mean specifically because if you followed the court case around him against his landlord and that whole thing, the rent board actually issued a fine against Jeffrey Rice, the landlord. The city elected not to enforce the fine because the city basically thought it was not BS, but that it wasn't clear and that he was told to correct something and he corrected it. And that's how the city operates. The fines are really, if you're from the city of Portland, not parking tickets, but at the housing level, if they just want compliance. The fines are there to have teeth in case a landlord really just keeps ignoring them and ignoring them, whether it's life safety, you know, even before there was rent control, life safety issues or whatever. They don't want to fine you. They just want you to comply. They want your building safe. They want you to follow the rules.
It looks like we have another question. Alberto was asking, on banking your rent increases, can you save it for the next tenant?
So again, that banked rent applies to the unit. So think about all rents as relating to the unit, not to the tenant. So yes, your banked rent will continue to be banked rent, whether it's that tenant or that tenant leaves and you apply it to the next tenant, but you still hit the 10% cap, even in a turnover, which to me seems really nonsensical, because that new tenant may be very able to pay a higher rent, willing to pay a higher rent. You may need the money to take care of your building and want to charge more, and you're not allowed to. So, you know, the example I give is, great, I have a studio that was at $700 for 9 years. Well, when it turned over, I could take my 10 applicants and I could choose a doctor to rent it to. I could only go up 5% on my $700, but that doesn't mean I rent it to someone who's low income. It's just keeping the rent low. You can still rent it to somebody who could afford a lot more.
We have another question. What about monthly furnished rentals? Katie Hogan would like to know.
So because this was not contemplated through a council with feedback and input, there are a lot of things they didn't think about. So short-term rentals are not considered. They're not exempt. So theoretically, this applies to short-term rentals, but talk about like square peg, round hole. It just doesn't even make sense. You read the language and try and apply it to a short-term rental. It doesn't mean anything. So what does the city do? They just kind of don't enforce it with short-term rentals. Monthlies, theoretically, are covered by this. So do what you will. We have heard situations of people charging for the furniture. So it's a furnished rental, you're rent controlled, so you're still only at $1,000, but you're charging $500 for the furniture or $1,000 for the furniture rental. Is that legal? I don't know. It's not addressed in the ordinance. So if a tenant complained, you get this tenant, they're happy, they've got their beautiful furnished rental, but suddenly, somebody knocks on their door and tells them all about rent control, and they complain to the city. I don't know what would happen. I don't think the city knows what would happen. They'd probably pass it to the rent board, and the rent board would have some painfully nonsensical discussion that would go around in circles for 2 hours. and they'd vote on something. And then if you disagreed, you could sue them. I mean, that's really like what would happen.
Very litigious.
So other things that aren't contemplated. So sorry, just on that
No,
same
go ahead.
vein is, if you pay heat right now, you've got one heating system, but you decide you want to put in heat pumps, and now the tenants can pay heat. Well, that seems to constitute like a rental increase, but it's not addressed in the ordinance. The ordinance says that the rent should stay for all the same things that are provided now. So if the rent includes all this stuff, your rent control sort of keeps that whole package together. But buildings change and rents change, or what if suddenly you can lease out that parking that used to be included, but now the neighbor wants to pay you $100 for the parking space? These things just are not addressed. So I would say my advice is be as aggressive as you can be in terms of your interpretation, and make them tell you you're wrong. Because again, it's complaint based. So if everybody's happy, everybody's happy.
Brit, Lynn Hallett wants to know, when a renter occupied 2-unit conveys and becomes an owner occupied 2-unit, does rent control no longer apply to the rented unit?
That's correct. It does not apply to the entire building in an owner occupied 2, 3, or 4. Now, what's not clear to me, I think I know what the city would say, is if it was investor owned 2-unit, so there was a base rent filed with the city, and then someone moves into it. Now it's not rent controlled. They sell it 5 years later. Does it go back to that base rent? Was that base rent still the base rent, or does base rent reset? And some of those things are not clear. Likewise, if I rent to some tenants and they have Section 8, well, now rent control doesn't apply. So you should all know that that's actually a very good option for you now. If you're really stuck, and I've got some units that were, $1,000, but Section 8 will pay $1,600. Well, great, forget rent control. I'm going to go from 1,000 to 1,600. My 10-year tenant finally left. I figured I could get it back. Now the only way for me to get it back is to rent to a subsidized tenant, because then I can ignore rent control completely. So that's one option that you should know about, and it's not a terrible option. But the question we were at was, then when that subsidized tenant leaves, does it go back to my $1,000, or did it wipe out the base rent completely and I start fresh? I think it probably goes back to the base rent, but who's keeping track?
Right.
We don't know.
So as a real estate agents right now, like, what do you think is the advice that we need to have, or what's the elevator speech? What is the go-to thing that we need to know and just advise our clients up to?
Well, I think it's first being clear on if they are an owner occupant and they just want to live in Portland, and a multi-unit is a good way for them to be able to live in Portland. If that's the case, great. Don't really worry about it. From a value standpoint, we haven't seen 2, 3, and 4 units be impacted by rent control. Mostly, they're really more functioning like the single family house market and condo market, where people need a place to live. They're willing to pay a premium. They'll pay a premium for a 3-unit. So there's that piece. If they're an investor, I would tell them to go read up, and they've got to just know what they're getting into. This is a big deal. I think Portland is still sort of a blue chip stock. If they can make it work, fine. They will always have their units full. They will always be able to take the maximum increases allowed. So they'll always be pressing up against it. And if they can make the numbers work, then fine. But they need to educate themselves and not trust you on what's going to what it's going to be like to own a rent controlled unit in Portland.
And how do you think that's going to impact pricing?
It is impacting pricing. Absolutely. I mean, we've sold, so mostly 5 units and up are the ones that are most clearly impacted. But if for years buildings were sold because there was some value add, the rents were probably a little low, a buyer could go in, fix up the unit, get the rents up a little bit, and so they would pay a little more for the building based on what it could become. Well, now there is no could become. It just is what it is. And we sold one of the best portfolios, the coolest one I've ever had the opportunity to sell, and it was 40 units up on the Eastern Prom with a huge parking lot. These units had water views, parking. It was incredible. They should be condos. It could have been high-end rentals, and it sold for the current cash flow. It could have been almost anywhere. And the fact that it had water views was mostly irrelevant to the value. And it sold for 7.5 million, and it probably would have sold for 10 million otherwise, had there not been rent control. So that's an extreme view and a big asset. But we are seeing it just, what are your current rents? So for your current clients are, take every increase you can get because you're going to need it when you sell, because they're going to pay you based on the rents that are there today, not the rents they might be able to get.
Great. Danielle Reed had asked, can you renovate a 5-unit to a 4-unit?
So in the city of Portland, you are allowed to take away 2 units without paying a fee. So you can make a 3 a 1, you can make a 5 a 3, you can make a 5 a 4. It's hard to get them back, so make sure you really want to do that. But yes, a 5 to a 4 probably increases value. Would have done that before rent control. It does it even more in rent control, because a 4-unit is now residentially financed property. You've got 30-year fixed rate financing, owner occupants, all the good stuff. 5 units, you're pure investor, commercial financing, and now with rent control, it's even worse. So yes, that's an option. If you want to eliminate 3 units, you'll pay for the 3rd one.
And then Katie Treem's asking, what about work for housing? Is that covered by rent control?
Workforce
Like
housing?
workforce housing, yep.
So the way it's defined is if you receive some of the payments for rent from a municipality or the state or the federal government. So I don't know what workforce means, but if there's a subsidy in place,
probably
then,
like J5 students, right, Katie? Is that what you're thinking? Like, yeah. So like
employees, yeah.
if they are not
no.
receiving a subsidy, I don't know that they would qualify. The language is pretty easy to find in the ordinance, and I would go just reread it. There is something about, there are like hospitals and I don't know, schools, dorms may be exempt. So you could look into that. Other things that we're not clear on is if an employer master leases a building, so the employer is basically the tenant, and then they just put a bunch of employees in the building, and the housing is more related to their compensation. Well, those tenants aren't really paying rent. So there may be ways to kind of get around it-ish. We certainly are selling buildings to employers who need housing for their staff, and they are becoming one of the players in the investment market of multifamilies. Yeah, and if they're not charging their tenants rent, or it's sort of a different structure, then maybe kind of doesn't apply. They're kind of just getting around it.
Carrie Boothie was asking, will rent control ever get overturned?
That's just the segue I needed for the other point I want to make before we run out of time, which is very important for all of you to know. Some of us have been working very hard. We have, once we realized we didn't have a legal path to challenging the new version of rent control in Portland, we realized we wanted to get a change on the ballot. So we have written a change, and it and collected signatures, and that it will be on the ballot in, I hope it will be on the ballot in June. The signatures have been submitted to the city, and are currently being vetted to see if they're going to be approved. And our change is this: it's small. There are a lot of things we would have wanted to change in what is a 17-page ordinance. It's very complex. Certainly was not the intention of referendum to pass complex housing policy. It was more for up or down things like abortion, gay marriage, more binary issues than housing policy. But here we are. So the change we're making, and I want to make sure you all know about this and support it if you are willing, is, and let me give just a little bit of backstory. Because of the restrictions that I've been describing, the result is tenants in Portland have seen more rent increases since rent control passed than ever before, because you can't catch up. So that situation with my $700 tenant, well, I just left her at $700 for like 9 years because I knew, like, I'm fine, she's fine. But when she leaves, I'll go clean up the unit and then I'll get more rent. Well, now I've got a 9-year-old tired unit and I can't get more rent. I can get 5% more. So what do I have to do? I have to start raising the rent every single year. If I look at any unit that's under market, I've got to take every increase they can give me. So existing tenants have seen more rent increases than ever before because of rent control. That's the irony. And it's because the rent sticks with the unit. If it operated like we think most rent control, well, we know rent control, most rent controls do, and what you're probably thinking of when you think of rent control, which is when the tenant leaves, then you can reset to market. That's what we know about New York City. People hold on to their units forever, but when they leave, then you can charge market. That's the one piece we're trying to get back in. And we made this as soft as we could, so that if the tenant leaves voluntarily, so this is their ordinance, this is our change, it's one paragraph out of 17 pages. When the tenant leaves voluntarily, the unit is allowed to be marketed sort of at the discretion of the homeowner. That's it. That's all we're trying. So the tenant has to leave voluntarily. You can't even kick them out and get it raised. So that takes the pressure off of housing providers to be increasing rents on existing tenants. We can kind of go back to how it was. And yet when the tenant leaves, you can go in, you can clean up that unit and then get market rent. We kind of can live with everything else. Everything else sucks. No application fees, 90-day notice. There's a bunch of stuff we still don't like. But this is something we really feel like we can sell. So it's called an act to improve tenant protections. It says the act removes incentives for landlords to increase rents for existing tenants and discourages no-cause evictions by allowing for the establishment of new base rents at the time of a new tenancy, but only in instances when the prior tenant moves out voluntarily. The act also brings Portland's rent stabilization ordinance into alignment with most local and national rent stabilization ordinances. We collected 4,000 signatures. We need 1,500 valid. We collected 4,000 signatures in about 2.5 weeks. It cost us a lot of money. I'm still collecting money for the bills we have to pay to have gotten those 4,000 signatures. We had about $50,000. We need to win this election in June. This is a game changer, and we're doing it in June because June is very low turnout. We only expect about 2,500 to maybe 4,000 people to vote. There are 350 realtors who live in Portland. If all 350 realtors go vote, if all the housing providers who live in Portland go vote, we win. It's that simple. We don't need to get overwhelming numbers. And we are hopeful that when people walk into the ballot and vote and read this, they see that this actually makes sense and this is better and they vote for it. That's how the prior rent controls have passed. It's the title and the summary. And this title and summary is true. It's actually better, and it's better for tenants and better for housing in Portland. So that's one thing to know. The other line you can say to people is it preserves all tenant protections in the existing ordinance. So some people, oh no, I'm for the tenants. I'm not gonna sign that. This preserves all the tenant protections. Everyone. The only thing that's affected is when the tenant leaves voluntarily. Period. So that's really important to know about. And the realtor community is engaged with our campaign because we are now that the signatures are in, we assume they're going to be validated, then it will be official, and we're putting together a campaign, and the realtor organizations are again fully engaged and a really strong partner with us.
One question, Maria, I don't know if this was already answered for you, but Maria's asking to clarify the 5% increase is permitted if you evict a tenant.
Maybe not. I don't recall, Maria. Do you know? Or was that a prompt because you know the answer? I think it might not be.
Not really. I mean, I don't know. No.
I mean, that's down to a level of detail. Like, just if you're in there and you're evicting, like, you should be reading this stuff and getting engaged. I think Maria might have highlighted, a lot of the little details that are in there. I want to briefly mention South Portland just because it's coming and it probably will pass. South Portland, in my opinion, is doing a much better job. And I testified last week, I think it was, and did not oppose it. I said, look, I'm not coming out in support, but I'm not opposing it either. They are legitimately, and I think reasonably, trying to put guardrails on really bad landlord behavior. And if for anyone following it, what happened in Red Bank was the Red Bank Village, I don't know how many units are there, but a fair number, sold to a company out of LA. They came in and dropped significant rent increases, like 25% or more, on 60 families. I'm making up round numbers, but it's like more than 60 families. Kids in schools, they were all going to be displaced. I mean, those families couldn't absorb those rent increases that quickly. The city of South Portland could not find 60 more apartments for them. It was going to be really disruptive. So the city of South Portland put an eviction moratorium in place. So basically froze that and said, whoa, you guys are being such jerks. We have to actually freeze the whole system because we can't let these 60 families get kicked out on the street while we figure something out. And they've taken their time over more than 6 months, and they've come up with some guidelines that, frankly, we can kind of live with, which is 10% increase on existing tenants, which frankly, if you talk to any landlord, I don't know that anyone goes up more than 10% on an existing tenant, that you just wake up one morning and say, Sue, she's nice and all, but boy, we'll just lay out some huge increase. It just doesn't happen. It happens when it sells. And the new owner comes in and says, well, I just paid a lot because I see these rents are under market, so I'm going to jack up all your rents. So existing rents at 10%. And I think it's 90-day notice. And it's for owners who own 15 units or more. So that's not crazy. That does sort of put guardrails on their really egregious behavior, while not really changing the life of the way most of us actually do business. And frankly, that's where I think we would like to be involved in the conversations with these municipalities and officials, and trying to have a constructive conversation about what's the actual problem. How can we help with the actual problem, and not just be trying to grind out the landlords because we can, because we're just so far left. We think housing should be nationalized.
In line with that, it looks like Alberta is asking, do you think that the state will adopt Portland's rent control for all the towns in the state?
Well, rent control is not being proposed at the state level. There are a lot of little pieces that are being proposed right now at the state. And so we're watching all of those. And I would strongly, again, encourage you to reach out to your local reps. The message we want to get out there from our state perspective is, why are you, sort of assaulting landlords? What's with this onslaught against landlords? I mean, they're just picking at every little thing at the state level, and they're just coming from all angles. As an example, I had a pretty long conversation with Chris Kessler, who I've gotten to know and like personally from South Portland, but he is a pretty far left tenant advocate guy. And he wanted to talk about application fees. He wanted to stop landlords from using application fees as a revenue generator. Stories about landlords charging 20 application fees for one unit. Well, I said, that's great. Let's work on that together. That should not be happening. Well, that's not the bill he came out with. He came out with a bill that said, eliminate all application fees. So this is my frustration, is you try and engage in a conversation and actually come up with something constructive, and they just come in with a sledgehammer and go for the whole thing. So please reach out to your reps and say, we're at the table, we're happy to engage in conversations, but we're actually providing the housing you need. Don't drive us all out of business, because we'll all just sell out to companies from LA, and you can have those guys to deal with. And I don't think that's what we want and what's best for Maine.
One last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Cheryl's wondering, is there some place where we can get the title and summary? Cheryl,
It's on the RHA website. It will be published, I'm sure, from the city shortly, and we can, I don't know if there's a follow-up email to this, but we can certainly can include it there. But if you're not a member, if you care about this stuff at all, personally or professionally, I would strongly encourage everyone to become a member of the Rental Housing Alliance, rhamaine.org. It's a great organization. We're getting better and stronger, more professional. We've got some part-time hired staff now and PR. So we've got weekly emails that go out. We've got discussion forums on all these issues. So the resources are there daily, weekly, your peers to ask questions to, the documents with resources, updates, the legislative updates. That group is helping drive the stuff we're watching at the state level. So you'll get updates on that. So it's kind of all there. And for $100 a year, it's about the lowest membership you're going to have. And some of you might even want to join at a slightly higher level and sponsorship or whatever, and get your name out there, because obviously it's a good place to network too.
That's great. Any final questions as we wrap up this topic? Any parting words, Brit, that you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I just thank everyone for your attention and interest. This has got to be one of the more dry, annoying topics that I get to speak on, and it's we're all deep in, but I think it's just important that we all feel invested in this. This is our community, and it's sort of happening to us right now, but there is control that we can take back, and I think being productive, positive voices in the conversation, and not being shy or embarrassed to speak out on these topics is important, and with your neighbors and with your clients. And we love Maine. Housing is a challenge right now, and we need to just all be part of the conversation. I'm hopefully in the next few years sort of working myself out of this job in quite such a full-time role. So anyone else who wants to step up and get more engaged, I think my point is that there's opportunities. This is mostly volunteer work that we're doing. And so if this is something that you enjoy thinking about or passionate about, just let me know. We always need more help.
And are you
good to see everyone.
and Aaron still talking about doing something in April with the legislative?
Oh yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so Aaron Chadbourne and I are co-chairs of the Realtor Legislative Action Committee. Paul's been chair in the past, and others. And so we are doing some events. We did one last summer or so, where we had a few local sort of political leaders out and a great discussion down at DeMillo's. And we're planning another one. We don't have a date yet, to talk about short-term rentals and policy, because every municipality is looking at short-term rentals in the same way they're looking at these issues. And I think there could be really a rich conversation there, because I know some realtors who are against short-term rentals and they think it's taking housing away. And is it different in different communities? So I'm hoping we can put together a really robust discussion about it, sort of philosophically around housing and policy and all that. So just keep your eyes open for that. And the Legislative Action Committee, if you would like to be involved with that, we would love to have you. We meet once a month, talk about issues, and are trying to keep our fingers on the pulse of the different communities. And so if you're really embedded in Scarborough or Gorham or some other town, like, that's what we need to know. The Greater Portland Board touches so many different communities. Even our paid lobbyist folks can't keep track of all the towns. And so, as an example, Carrie Martin has been doing a great job keeping track of what's going on in Yarmouth as they're thinking about inclusionary zoning and some other issues there. And she's been sort of feeding that information back into this committee. Chris Davis has been involved with the group, and others. So another great way to be involved.
Wow, so much going on.
A lot of stuff.
So much going on. Brit, I can't thank you enough. I know everybody is just like blown away by your perspective and everything that you know. It's like we just need your brain and our brains for the day, huh?
It's a scary place. You don't want to be there. This is as much as you want.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This was great. I would love to hear feedback, so feel free to email me, kim@kimtarbox.com. Just a little plug for Women's Council. If you have no idea what we are, please head over to our new website, wcrmaine.org. It's got a list of all our events coming up in March. We've got the ins and outs of new construction, which will be essential knowledge for real estate agents. It's going to be a panel discussion on March 28th from 9:30 to 11. It'll be at Throttle Car Club in Scarborough. So mark your calendars for that. That'll be free. And so we just kind of have a better understanding about how we can represent our clients during new construction. So that's all we have for you guys today. Thank you for joining us. And again, if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Brit. What I'll do is send everybody an email with all the links we talked about today. And if you've got any questions, again, just reach out.
Hey, Kim, just a quick comment. If this subject excites you and gets you revved up, then this is a great reason why you need to be in Augusta at Realtor Rally Day.
Yeah,
because you have a chance to meet these legislators, and there are 2,144 bills that are coming our way this year between January and June that we're reviewing. So if you think this one subject of rent control in Portland is exciting, then come to Realtor Rally Day in Augusta, because there'll be a lot more things we can talk about besides rent control, short-term rentals, PFAS. We can go on. And Brit, you're phenomenal. he's a great leader for this community, and we're very thankful to have his expertise. So thank you, Brett.
Thanks, Paul.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thanks, everyone,
everybody.
for taking
Thanks.
the time.
Have a great day. Stay safe and warm.